Right. I may not be able to stay in the chair the entire time, but I'm going to try to do that. Because I think that probably by rights I probably should be home. But anyway, so we actually have a kind of a double-barreled class tonight. Because last time, as you will recall, remember you wanted to get exposed to some actual rabbinic commentary. And so I brought in something to help us do that. But this was also the night when I was going to talk about Jewish history. So I'm sure we're going to be able to do both of those. Cover rabbinic literature and Jewish history in one evening. That's going to be a challenge. Okay, I think we'll start with the text, since that's kind of where we were last time. So you'll get a little white sheet here, and I'll give you a word or two of explanation before we actually launch into the text. There are different kinds of rabbinic interpretation, or Midrash, of the biblical text. Some are, whoa, what did I do?
So the problem is that these antennas,
Oh,
and maybe the volume needs to turn down a little bit.
okay. Can you still hear?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right. Good. All right. So in large, gross terms, Midrash is broken down into two major kinds: halachic, or legal, and agadic, which can be philosophical, narrative, stories, all sorts of things of that sort. Some people would say that agadic is just non-legal, whatever is not legal. In either case, what's involved is that the process that I mentioned last week, that's called Lidrosh et Elohim, to inquire of God, is what's going on. The rabbis, or whoever's reading the text, is essentially what we would say in modern literary terms, interrogating the text. That is, you're involved in a kind of dialogue with the text. You're asking the text questions. You're exploring it and pulling out answers from the text. My old Bible professor, Harry Orlinsky, would want me to hastily add that there is a difference between what a biblical critic might call exegesis, which is to take meaning out of the text, and eisegesis, which is what most people do, which is to superimpose meaning on the text. So you have to be careful that what you're doing is taking something that's actually in the text. But if that's what you're doing, then pretty much anything else is fair play. And by that I also mean that for the rabbis, the text is radically meaningful. And by that what I mean is, normally when we think about any kind of text, whether it's a simple text, I went to the store to buy some cornflakes, or a literary text, poem, or what have you, we start with what you would call the plain sense of the text. Now, we start with the sentence like, I went to the store to buy cornflakes, it may mean only that. Sometimes a cigar is only a cigar. But sometimes maybe the cornflakes are a symbol. Or maybe the store refers to not just the common type of store you're thinking of, like go to H-E-B, but maybe a store as in some treasure house. So there are a lot of ways in which you could break down what that plain sense of the text means, but basically what we're talking about is looking at what the plain sense of the text is and operating with that. The rabbis are not satisfied with that. Why? Because the text for them is holy. Everything about the text is holy, not just the plain sense of the text. For example, if you read any text, which text are you reading? The one that is formed by the, let's say, black letters on the white paper, or the one that's formed by all these spaces between and around the letters? You see, there's really two texts that exist simultaneously. Follow me? You can interpret that second one as well. And not only that, but the physical dimensions of the text are something that you can interpret. What about a misprint? Well, we would just say normally it's just a misprint. But if it's a holy text, nothing is in there that is accidental. So a misprint, an extra letter, whatever it may be, is there to be interpreted as well. By the way, in Hebrew, each letter has a numerical equivalent. So a word has a numerical equivalent. You can compare and contrast words based on words that equal each other. Okay? And so on, and so on, and so on. When I say that the text is holy or radically meaningful, that's the kind of thing that I mean to include. Okay? Plus the rabbis, you may not necessarily think this, the rabbis actually have a very good sense of humor. And they love puns. So they play with these words a lot. Now the other thing you have to know before we launch into this particular text is that Hebrew works with a 3-letter root system. Every word is compounded of 3 root letters that have a basic meaning, and then they're manipulated, those 3 letters are manipulated, either by adding a prefix, an infix, or a suffix, or changing the pattern of the vowels. But within every word, there's a 3-letter root. Okay? So a word that may mean one thing is linked to another word which means something very different, but has the same 3-letter root. Okay? Which is what we're going to be dealing with in this particular Midrash. All right. So this is a Midrash on the very first verse in the book of Genesis. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz, which usually gets translated as, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You familiar with this? Yeah. Okay. Except that's a major mistranslation, and I'll tell you why. Hebrew does not have vowels. Vowels came later. You write Hebrew, even today, modern Hebrew, not poetic Hebrew, but everyday sort of Hebrew, you write it without vowels. Because if you know the patterns, in other words, everything has 3-letter roots, you add different prefixes and suffixes and so forth, you know the patterns, then you know how to pronounce the word. You don't actually need the vowels. You know that, right? Oh. Well, this is the first time I'm going to deviate from what I promised my wife. I'll give you an example. Tell me if you can read this. This was something I saw on the subway in New York when they drive riding to school. Can you read that?
If you can read this, you can be something.
Oh, yes, something. Court reporter. Okay. Now, what I just showed you is that the meaning of words is carried in the consonants and not in the vowels. You following me? You don't actually need vowels. If you know the language, if I'd given you something in French, you probably couldn't do it, or maybe somebody could, but most of you probably couldn't. But if you know English, then you don't really need the vowels to be able to read it. Okay? So, although it does leave some interesting possibilities, like, some of those words you could probably think of another word that would fit it.
Yeah,
but to get the English plus the context, once you start to read it, you can read it correctly. All right. So you have lots of words with compounded out of 3-letter roots with no vowels. So if you look at this verse, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. Okay. So in the beginning, He, meaning God, created. Well, the problem with this is that the word Reshit, which means beginning, is what's called in Hebrew a smichut, which means it's special construction, which you can do in Hebrew. Put two nouns together and it becomes the something of something. Okay? So, like in verse Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai, the beginning of wisdom is the awe of or fear of the Lord. Okay? Reshit Chachma, the beginning of wisdom, the blank of blank. It's good, right? You got Reshit here, but the second part is not there. And it doesn't say anything like, in the beginning of what? In the beginning of what? So you have to remember that the word bara is not there, just the 3 letters bet, resh, aleph. So what that means is you can vocalize it differently. You still have exactly the same text. And what you do is you vocalize it to say bro, which means creating. So you get in the beginning of creating. Okay? So the real translation, the correct translation of this verse is, when God began to create the heaven and the earth was unformed and void. Is that different? How's it different? In the beginning, how do you know what that is? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. How's that different from when God began to create the heaven and the earth?
You're not saying it's the beginning.
Sorry?
You're not saying it's the beginning.
Yeah. It's not saying anything about what the earth was. It says simply that when God began to create, this was the way it was. But it doesn't say anything about some form that pre-existed. Okay? So the idea of what they call creatio ex nihilo, the creation out of nothing, is blown out of the water. It's not what the text means. Okay? Because grammatically it makes no sense to say, in the beginning He created, because it doesn't work grammatically in Hebrew. So, starting from that premise, now it gets really wild. And you got to tell me if you're not with me, because it gets fancier. Okay? So, this word Bereshit, which usually gets translated in the beginning, the letter bet, which I put up on the board there, Bereshit, you see it, is a conjunction. It means in or with. Now, Reshit means beginning. Okay? So God created with Reshit, whatever Reshit is. Okay? You with me so far? God created with the beginning. Not God created in the beginning. God created with beginning. What is the beginning of what? How do we know what Reshit refers to? Well, we can pull a verse out of another part of the Torah, which says, and it's mentioned before, Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Okay? So, maybe God creates with the beginning of wisdom. Reshit now becomes a kind of stand-in for the word Chachma, or wisdom. So God began to create with wisdom. Okay? That was the implement, or the tool. We together so far? All right? Okay, so now we're going to actually go to the text. I think we're ready. All right, first part of the text is just going to establish a couple of qualities of this tool. So it says, Rabbi Yeshaya commenced his exposition thus. Now he's quoting from the book of Proverbs. Then I was with him as a nursling, and I was daily all delight. So who was it that was with God daily as a nursling? By the way, if anybody wants to make an argument about the patriarchal nature of the biblical text. This is a good verse to point to. Okay, because God is nursing this thing, whatever it is. Anyway, well, the word amon is the nurse thing. And what does that amon mean? Well, it can mean in different contexts. Tutor, it can mean covered, it can mean hidden, and it can mean great. Now, what is it that we might say, the thing about things Jewish, is tutor, covered, hidden, and great? Well, how many of you have ever been to a Jewish service? Never been? Oh! So if you go to a synagogue and say on the Sabbath, and they take the Torah out to read, right? Has anybody ever seen this? Yeah. So, what does it look like? Yeah.
Oh, it's scrolls.
Right, but when you take it out of the ark, before you read it, what does it look like? The Torah is inside something. It's kind of, it's dressed. It's got a mantle. It's got little crowns on it, and so on and so forth. So it's hidden. And what does it do? Well, we study it and it teaches us, and it's great, right? And what was the other one? Tutor, yeah, it's teaching. Covered, hidden. Well, that's another way of saying covered, but what the Torah means is not obvious. I mean, there is that surface level of the text, but what it really means is you have to dig for it. The meaning, the serious meaning, is hidden somewhat, okay? So they're really describing Torah here, okay? So, here, what is the idea that's being expressed? That Torah is saying, then I was with him, meaning God, as a nursling, and I was daily all delight. So, when was this that the Torah was with God? You guys are Christians, you should know this one really easily. In the beginning was
The Word. The Word was with God. The Word is God.
the Word was with God, right? Yeah, okay.
The Word was God.
And who is the Word?
Jesus.
Ah.
To John.
Yes, Jesus, who was Jesus ever a nursery? No. He was a little baby, no?
Oh,
Wasn't he?
I didn't interpret it that
It's all Christmas stories, little baby Jesus
Yes.
in the manger,
way.
right?
Yes.
Okay? All right. I'm just pointing out something that you guys already know. I'm not telling you anything new, right? You already know this, okay?
We're so confused because
Why are you confused?
that's one way to do it. Another way, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus just shows up as an adult.
I don't care.
And in the Gospel of John, he drops out of heaven.
Yeah, well, that's not my problem. Look, let me mention to you one thing. I mean, look, this is the corrupting Greek, okay? Because for the Greek influence in Christianity drives everybody crazy because it has to be logical. So, Greeks love syllogisms, okay? So you have a logical train. Jewish interpretation is not serial. It's not logical. It's associative. You can have more than one idea because they're all representations, incomplete representations of some aspect of our relationship with God, but none of them encompasses everything. We talked about this last time. This is the notion of idolatry. So yeah, one story that says this, another story says that, and that's fine. Okay, it's like the old joke which I mentioned before, when you have two Jews, you have three opinions. Okay, because the idea is there isn't going to be one story that is exactly right. Not because it isn't properly reconciled with the other stories, but because there's always going to be more than one story. That's the nature of the beast. So for us, you got 4 different gospel accounts of how Jesus came to be. No problem for us.
Right.
Problem for you, but not a problem for us. Okay? All right. It isn't necessarily a problem for you either. It's a different kind of thing. But anyway, so here's this idea that Torah, the word, in the Christian tradition, made human in the form of Jesus. The Jewish tradition, still literally the word, was with God. Okay? Why? Why was the Torah with God at the beginning? What was the Torah's purpose? Now you have to listen to this carefully, because if I do say so myself, it's brilliant.
That's brilliant.
The Torah declares, "I was the working tool of the Holy One, blessed be He." In human practice, when a mortal king builds a palace, he builds it not with his own skill, but with the skill of an architect. The architect, moreover, does not build it out of his head, but employs plans and diagrams to know how to arrange the chambers and the wicket doors. Thus God consulted the Torah and created the world, while the Torah declares, "In the beginning God created," referring to Torah, as in the verse, "The Lord made me as the beginning of His way." Okay? So here's the idea. We come kind of full circle. Reshit, meaning the beginning of God's way, is Torah. That's the plan. That's the blueprints that God uses to create the world. So you ask yourself, well, why does God need blueprints? And who created the blueprints? All good questions. Okay. Here's the interesting question. Can God just do whatever God wants? Well, theoretically, yeah. But does God choose to do whatever God wants? No. God chooses to be bound by certain laws, certain rules, certain values. This is something that we learned, for example, the story about Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah. When God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham bargains with God to, ultimately, if there are only 10 people in the city who are righteous, will you spare the city? How does Abraham clinch his argument with God? How does he convince God not to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Do you remember?
That even 10 people are valuable, so.
True, but how does Abraham sort of stick it to God? Get him to agree to this.
Yeah.
He said something that God cannot deny. He says, the Hebrew it's one of the great lines of Hebrew. Hashafet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Shall the judge of all the earth not act justly? Okay? Shall the judge of all the earth not act justly? Okay? What he's saying is, look, you claim that you operate in terms of moral laws. So aren't you also bound by those laws? If you want people to respect you as the judge of all the world, then you have to operate by the same rules that you expect everybody else to operate by. This is what you call speaking truth to power. Okay, not what passes for speaking truth to power these days, which is not much in the way of truth and not too much power involved. You're basically calling the omnipotent God. If you don't want to be a hypocrite, this is what you got to do. Okay. All right. He has a little gumption, Abraham. But my point is that Abraham establishes the idea that God is bound by the same laws that everyone and everything is bound by. Okay.
Well, does that help then with things like accepting evolution of land?
You know, see, here's where that nasty Greek part comes out again. Okay, remember the segment from the Frisco kid that I showed you. And Chief asks, Can your God make rain? Sure he can, but he doesn't. No, he doesn't. Why doesn't he rain? If he can, why doesn't he make rain? Because it's not his department. Well, what does he do? He gives us strength when we're weary. He gives us light when we're lost in the darkness, and so on and so forth. But he does not bring rain, crack of thunder, and then he changes his mind. Okay? So the answer is yes, unless God changes his mind. Okay? The point being, yeah, is God bound by all these laws? Absolutely. Is God also the creator of miracles? Yeah. Even when they contradict science. But we're not talking about history here. We're talking about literature. Okay? It's like asking whether or not there really was a whale named Moby Dick.
A what?
It's like asking if there really was a whale named Moby Dick. Does it matter to Herman Melville whether or not there actually was such a whale? Of course not. Does it make the story less valuable if there was not such a whale? No, of course not. As a matter of fact, it actually makes it more valuable if there isn't such a whale. But that's another story. All right, so God is pictured here as consulting the Torah, as if God were the builder of the palace and the Torah were the blueprints that the palace is constructed by. Now look, let me ask you a question. If you are the conductor of a symphony orchestra and you look at the score of a symphony, does it look different to you than if it looks to me who can't read music? Sure. In fact, if you're a conductor of a symphony orchestra, you can hear the music just by looking at the score, even though there are no instruments played. You can read it and you can hear it in your head, right? Or if, think of another example. You have one here. If you're an architect, you can create blueprints. Well, you can visualize every aspect of that building just by looking at the blueprints. I can't. Can you? No. But if you know how to read the blueprints, then in a sense, the house or the building is there, even though all you've done is read the blueprints. You follow me? Okay? So in the Torah, if you know how to read it, what do you find? What is it that God is building? This is already the text.
A story to live by.
No.
Oh, what are you
What is he building in the story?
Oh, he's building the seas, the animals, the sky, the everything.
The creation, right?
Creation.
Which he analogizes to what? A palace. The king building a palace is God creating the universe. Okay? So the universe is God's palace. And the Torah is the plan for building this palace. Now, if you know how to read the blueprints, that is, if you know how to read the Torah, then everything is there. Because the very thing itself, the universe, is there in the Torah. Follow me?
The Torah is the first 4 books of the Bible.
Five, but as I said before, Torah is much larger. The Torah can also be the generic Torah. Torah is scripture. It's scripture and its interpretation. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
This to me sounds like the Torah is more important than God. The Torah, and who wrote the Torah if not God directing people to write it?
That is a really good question. Who wrote the Torah? Well, of course, to some degree, you have to say that God did. But to what degree and how? It's a matter for some debate. Okay? See, I could have given you another Midrash from a different collection that centers on the fact that when the Torah is given at Mount Sinai, there is a cloud at the top of the mountain. Why is there a cloud at the top of the mountain?
So we can't see God's face?
Yes, but not just God's face, though. That's true. But expand a little bit. What's taking place at the top of the mountain? Moses is going up to the top of
The
the
burning
mountain.
bush? Or
Hmm?
the burning
No, burning bush is not a mountain. Different story.
I
Different story. Moses goes up the mountain. He comes down with what?
And he's all aglow, and he has heard from God.
Right, well, he comes down with something. What does he come down with?
Commandments.
He comes down with the commandments. He comes down with the Torah, right? So he goes up to the top. He's in this cloud with God. He comes down with the Torah. So somehow, God transmits the Torah to Moses, and Moses brings it down. Okay?
The whole thing, not just the Ten Commandments.
So that,
Depending on who you talk to. Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. The problem isn't solved by specifying what part or the whole thing. Problem is, how does God communicate to us?
through human beings.
How?
Oh,
If God were to talk to you, and you were to say to a number of people, you know, God talks to me all the time, what do you think other people would think of you?
well, you're special.
You're really special, right? Yeah. You're like a little loony,
Yeah,
right?
of course.
Okay, well, sure, because God doesn't talk to people normally, right? You don't know. How could you possibly know how God communicates? That's the problem. You know, I spoke last time about the idea of noise. That any communication system has a certain amount of noise in it. And that's true with whatever the system is. Okay? But here's the problem with divine revelation, however you want to understand it. Even though there is communication from one realm, really, to another realm, the divine to the human, somehow this happens without any distortion. Now that would make it the only such system in the world where that's true. It's universally true that systems of communication have noise in them. So how is it possible for God to communicate to people and for us to understand it? Because after all, it has to be in our terms, in our limited little human pea brain terms. And yet, it has to be absolutely true in all of the complexities that are implied at the same time. It's a contradiction. How that happens is not something that any of us understands or knows. Okay? So it's presented in the Midrash as taking place within the cloud. Because we really can't see how that process takes place. It's like what physicists call a black box.
Yeah.
You put something in here, it comes out here, and it's different. We don't know how it happens. It just does. Okay?
Yeah.
We can examine it and look at it and so on and so forth, and we may pull back the curtain a little bit, but the more we ask, the more we discover that there are things we don't understand about that process, whatever it happens to be. And the idea of communication is like that. Even communication between human beings, let alone communication between a human being and God, or whatever that might mean. So we don't really know how that happens. Did God communicate the entire Torah, just 10 rules, just the commandments? It depends. I mean, there's no way to actually know that. I don't know. I was going to say I wish I could tell you, but I'm not sure I wish I could tell you. I'm not sure that would actually be a good thing, even if I did know, which I don't. Okay. So here you have this idea that, as it were, Torah and God are kind of like a team that exists before creation. Torah has the same structure as the universe from which Torah, from which it is constructed. Not that it's the same matter, but that it follows the same form, same structure. Now, this is an interesting idea because it gets picked up much later in our own time by a fellow named Buckminster Fuller, who some of you may be familiar with, who talks about the idea that on all levels of creation, structures among the various component elements on that level of creation are the same. They have the same relationship to each other. Well, that's kind of neat, isn't it? Not only is it neat, it's what we would call unity or coherence. Okay? So when the Jewish tradition says that Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one, that's sort of the basic perception. That's pretty basic perception. That is to say, not just that God, that there aren't more than one God. It's that God and God's creation are unified. They have the same structure. They have the same components, if you like. There is a kind of coherence in the world that we exist in. The same coherence that exists within us is the coherence that exists outside of us. So that's really kind of what this Midrash is about. It's a Midrash about what does it mean when God began to create the universe. Well, I'm going to bet that this isn't anything like what you may have studied before about the first verse in the book of Genesis. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
One thing at a time, or
Sorry?
it's different than what he says, like he created this and he created that on the second
Right.
day. They're-
Yeah, well, there's lots of different stories. Lots of different stories. But this is just one of them. But it's very different than what you probably are used to. But it's, even within the Jewish tradition, it's just one of a lot of different stories. Midrash, Bereshit Rabbah, which is where this is from, is, that thick and it's big and it's all stories about the book of Genesis. There's a lot of interpretation. But you get a sense, at least a little bit, of what the texts are like and what it's like to study them. Before you move on, does anybody have any questions?
Why is it just the first 5 of our books still called our book, our Bible?
Why is it?
Or is there even a reason?
Well, I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean. I mean, Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. That's what it is. I mean, it's the name that those first 5 books are given collectively.
But I mean, that's what the Judaism is about. And no more than those 5 books?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
No.
That's just the Torah.
Yeah. But as I said, Torah is also becomes kind of like a generic kind of term.
Okay.
Okay. So it refers to scripture and it refers to all the interpretive literature surrounding the scripture. Okay. All right, that's a good question. Anybody else? Okay, let's go to history. All right, you have, wait, I didn't hit it out yet. All right, I have a little timeline that I want to give you. Just pass this around with you. Okay, so I have to stand up for a little while. Nobody's going to tell Linda, right? Okay. All right, so so when we talk about history, we start from the proposition that I mentioned in our first meeting, that Judaism is not equatable to religion. It's a people. And that people has a culture, a civilization. And that central in that civilization, as in many civilizations, is a religious domain, religious realm. Thank you. It's not the only thing that civilization has. The Jewish civilization has art, has literature, it has music, etc., etc., etc. But religion is an important domain. But all of these things together constitute a kind of culture. And that culture is reflected in how Jews live, wherever they happen to live and whenever they happen to live. Now, culture is not static. It changes, it develops, things drop out, things are added. All sorts of things happen to culture over time. It's kind of like when you see a friend after 25 years, and you ever wonder how it is that you still recognize the person? You know, I mean, they may not look that much like they used to look, you know, but somehow you still are able to recognize them. And sometimes you're not,
Yeah.
okay? But often you are, amazingly. Because there's something that they retain through all the other changes that take place that lets you identify who they are. Culture is kind of like that. And Jewish culture, like other cultures, is really a system of what you might call family resemblances. Okay? There are, you look at somebody and you say, you look so much like so-and-so. And it turns out that they're a cousin. Okay? Well, because there are some little features that maybe you couldn't even identify, couldn't put your finger on exactly, but are part of what people in this family look like. Okay? Maybe it's not just what they look like. Maybe it's a gesture or an intonation or whatever it may be. You're able to recognize somebody. Okay. So Jews have gone through history with this culture based on religion, language, books, etc., etc., etc. And in the process of this moving through history, it's not like they lived in a hermetically sealed bubble. They interacted in one way or another with all sorts of cultures along the way. So they also were influenced by and also influenced these cultures that they lived with and among. So it's not like you could say there is some Jewish culture. You couldn't possibly identify what that might be because there is nothing in Jewish culture that hasn't been affected in some way by living with other people. People used to say, well, what are the cardinal rules of Judaism, the cardinal features of Judaism? It turns out if you really look carefully, there aren't any. No, it's a set of family resemblances, okay? It's like this, okay? All right, so I don't know if anybody here is a Republican. If you are, I don't mean to be offensive, but I'm a Democrat. And most people in my family are Democrats. But I do have an uncle who's a Republican. And he doesn't believe much of anything that I believe. But he's still my uncle. And he gets invited to all the family occasions, even though he doesn't see the world the way the rest of the people in my family do. He's still a member of the family. I don't know that everybody's that happy about that, but he is, and he's a nice guy.
Yeah.
All right? But when it comes to politics and culture and society, there's almost nothing that I believe that he believes, and vice versa. How is it that we're still family? Well, we are. And even though you don't agree, we will be family regardless. You don't get to choose your family, I guess. Right? Well, you do. I guess you do in a way if you adopt. You know. But other than that, okay. So, Jews have lived in places where the majority culture was Christian or Muslim or Asian religions in China or in India, all sorts of places in the world. And not only that, but we've carried this culture with us for 3,500 years. So when we talk about Jewish history, we're talking about this group of people that goes through history associated with each other, with a general sort of culture that they share to some degree. And that history is really a history of two things. How Jews have interacted with and been acted upon by the cultures, the nation states, et cetera, that they have come across, and how that relates to how they see themselves, what they see the meaning of their existence to be, largely centered on the relationship of the Jewish people to God. But not only that. Okay. So in this context, what I'm going to say to you is, I'm not going to, in the little bit of time that we have, go through all the events of Jewish history. That's kind of ridiculous. But I'm going to talk about three of them that I think are particularly formative. Because I think that I can talk about them in such a way that they will help you to see some of the larger features of Jewish life and Jewish identity. So, maybe four. Let's see. All right, now I want to talk about Abraham. Now, when I talk about Abraham, we are kind of in the domain of history and kind of not. Was there an individual named Abraham? Well, it's hard to say. Maybe, maybe not. But there certainly was the understanding within the Jewish tradition that there was somebody who started the whole ball rolling. If his name was Abraham, fine. If it was not, it was something else, who knows? The point is, at some point in history, someone who is understood to be one of the originators of Judaism had an idea which was revolutionary in its time and continues to be revolutionary even today, even after 3,500 years. And that idea was that there is one God. I would say, we say there's a, well, what's the big deal? Everybody doesn't. But besides that, even people who say they believe in one God don't act as if they believe in one God. What do I mean? Well, what are some of the implications of belief in one God? Well, one of the things that you believe if you believe in one God is that this God is the organizer and the force behind the universe. And not only that, but since there is a unitary cause to the universe, then everything traces its origins back to that source. So what does that imply about human beings? Well, it implies, for example, that they're equal. They don't have they all have the same origin. That is a revolutionary idea. In world cultures, universally, until this idea comes up, it is understood that people are unequal, that nobles are who they are because they are better, that peons are peons because that's who they are in the world. The human beings don't have any such thing as inherent worth that is the same as the inherent worth of the next guy over. That's an idea that didn't always exist in human history. But if you believe that human beings are somehow essentially equal, then what are some of the other implications of that? Like, let's say, for law. Anybody?
Well, everybody is subject to the same laws.
Right. And does everybody get treated the same?
Should.
We're supposed to, right? And what about, so if there isn't one law for this group and another law for that group, and there's one law for everybody, then people should be treated the same way. And you get a notion of fairness, or equality. Just in case you think I'm overdrawing it, in the Code of Hammurabi, which I'm sure all of you have heard of it someplace along the line, there are a lot of different laws, and people often say that the Code of Hammurabi is sort of a precursor of the Torah in this regard. And nothing really can be further from the truth because, I mean, they're both codes of law in that sense, yes, but in the Code of Hammurabi, for example, if a member of the nobility is murdered, the penalty is death. If a member of the serf class is murdered, there is a monetary fine. I'm not going to argue about whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea. I mean, I think it's a bad idea, but the point I want to make about it is it doesn't imply that there is equality in terms of what life is worth. Some lives are just worth more than others. And that's the way it's supposed to be. This is the law. Okay? This is not, some aberration. Right? So when I say that there are implications to this that are revolutionary, I'm not overdrawing the case. There are all sorts of implications about the idea of this idea of God being one. For example, if God is one, regardless of whether there are different systems of religion, are systems of religion equally valid or unequal? Anything? Okay, we'll think it through. If there's only one God, regardless of remembering that how we picture God is not the same thing as what God is, right? Okay? So if there's only one God, does it matter if this religion pictures God in this way, and this religion pictures God in that way, and this religion pictures God in some other way? Are the other ones false and the one that I have true, or are they all true?
They're all true.
Yeah.
So if you're worshiping Buddha, for instance, that's
It's a different representation of God. Well, the point is not what is the Chinese, let's say, who is a Buddhist, believe about it, but how do I see it as somebody who believes in this monotheistic God? So it's what ought to happen is exactly the opposite of what some people think. Some people think that if you don't believe the same thing, that you're wrong. When in fact, if that's the case, then you don't actually believe in one God. Following me?
Yeah.
Okay. If you believe in one God, then all religions have some truth to them. You can go on down the line. All right? The reason I think this is important is that, again, it is totally revolutionary to say that other nations or other groups or other cultures are valid as your nation or group or culture is valid. And the crucial step in coming to that understanding is the idea that there is one God, who is the God of all humankind. Okay? Without that idea, then everybody is just in their own little domain, doing their own little thing, and there's nothing that holds it all together. So this moment of history, whenever it was, and whoever articulated it first, this moment of history where the idea of a monotheistic God comes into existence was a cataclysmically revolutionary moment in history. And it's the moment that sets the whole Jewish enterprise into movement. Because now you have a people that is organized around this principle. This people, called the Jewish people, is the bearer of this understanding. Okay? And you can say that on some level, Jewish history is about the working out of this relationship between the Jewish people and the one God. That our culture is about the meeting, the interaction between the Jewish people and this God. Now, before you say anything about it, I'm going to bring up the question of chosenness. Okay? Now, I'm going to tell you why this is, how do I put it? On the one hand, either much ado about nothing, or kind of a scurrilous kind of question. And I'll tell you why. Let's say that I think that Michelle Pfeiffer is the most beautiful woman in the world. Well, how should my wife Linda feel about that?
And she's less beautiful.
Oh, Linda is very beautiful. But Michelle Pfeiffer, I have to say, is more beautiful than Linda. Or let's say the most righteous woman in the world may be Mother Teresa. Okay? Linda's a very moral person, but is she as moral as Mother Teresa? Maybe not. She might come close. Oh, all right, yeah, but you know,
Yeah.
she's not Mother Teresa. You know. But because I can say all those things, does that mean that Linda is not beautiful and righteous? Of course not.
No.
If I say, I love this person, I love that person, I love the other person, maybe my sister or my brother or my best friend, and so on and so forth. I love all these different people. Does that mean I don't love Linda? Of course not. So explain to me what the problem is about the notion of the chosen people. What's the problem? If God loves the Jewish people, so what? Does that mean that God can't love you?
No.
No, of course not. That's silly, right?
Right.
Not only that, when do people get angry and upset about how much somebody that they care about loves somebody else? Speaking about, you know, life in general. When might your husband or your wife get upset about your loving another person?
When you give them more attention, the other person.
Yeah, like, and your husband or your wife begins to feel what?
Left out.
Yeah, left out.
I'm sorry?
Left out.
Left out or jealous?
Yeah.
Okay. See, I think that the brouhaha about the chosen people is about people who are jealous. To think that if God loves us, God can't love you, and therefore that's a problem. But I think that if somebody thinks that God can't love them because God loves somebody else, then they're the ones that have the problem. Not to put too fine a point on it. You know, the thing about the relationship with God is that all of us, how should I put it? All of us want our relationship to God to be special. And that's a good thing. But it's very hard for us as human beings to think that we can be special if other people are special also. We tend to think that if we're special, other people cannot be special. And that's something I think we have to get over. But be that as it may. So, anyway. So let's move on. Moving ahead 12 or 13 centuries, more than that. Should we do the Exodus from Egypt? Now we're going to skip the Exodus. We're going to go to the destruction of the temple. Okay. Now, you know that in ancient Judaism, there was a temple in Jerusalem. If you go to the city of Jerusalem today, you can see the outer wall of that temple. It's called either the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. It's actually not, what you see is not actually the wall of the original temple. That's underground. The wall was extended by Saladin of Crusade fame in the 13th century, I want to say. And he built up the walls right on top of the walls that Herod built, which were on top of the original walls that Solomon built. So if you want to see the original walls that Solomon built, you have to go dig underneath there. And that's the thing that you can't do because there are people in the world who don't want those walls to be exposed. Because if they get exposed, then it shows that Jews actually lived there way back when, and if Jews actually lived there way back when, then they actually have some kind of special relationship to the land, and if they have a special relationship to the land, then they have a right to be there, and if they have the right to be there, and so on and so forth. So in Israel, archaeology is politics, and you have to sort of bear that in mind. But that's why when a few years back, when the Israeli government tried to explore those walls, there were riots on the Temple Mount that stopped the exploration because there are people who didn't want them to be uncovered. Anyway, I promised I wasn't going to say anything about Israel. Well, I'm going to say something a little bit later. Anyway, so what was this temple? Well, as the Israelites left Egypt and wandered in the desert and eventually entered the land of promise and built a society and so forth, gradually there was a need to build some centralized institutions. All settled peoples have centralized institutions. And in Israel, that centralized institution was the Temple in Jerusalem. Now, to get an idea of what the Temple of Jerusalem was, you have to appreciate that it included many different activities. It was a garrison. Solomon had his army there. The Sanhedrin, the court of law, was located there. The courtyard where the temples, the sacrifices were done, was there. The The treasury was there. All sorts of different aspects of the governance of Israel were actually all housed together in the temple. So when the temple was destroyed, the second destruction in the year 70 of the Common Era, imagine for a minute there were, God forbid, an attack on the United States. And in this attack on the United States, Washington, D.C., the attack involved the destruction of the Supreme Court, the FBI, the Pentagon, the White House, the National Cathedral, Department of Justice. All those institutions were destroyed in one fell swoop. What would happen to our country if those institutions were all destroyed? We would be in chaos. Okay. All those different elements of the government were, yes, sir.
Oh, well, I was going to say I would rewrite my mythology.
Oh, yeah. How would you rewrite it?
To survive.
Sure. So, what Judaism did was exactly that. When the temple is destroyed, Judaism has to decide whether or not it can continue, because it's the foundations of its very society are destroyed. They're gone. Now you have to understand that this is not a process that only took place on an afternoon. There were a number of different revolts against the Romans, one of which leads to the destruction of the temple, but there were ones before, there were ones after. Anybody here ever seen the movie Life of Brian? Monty Python movie?
Yes.
And Brian and some of his cohort are sitting in this amphitheater in Jerusalem. And there's little knots of people sitting all around the amphitheater. And Brian says, well, who's that? Well, that's the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And who's that? That's the Popular Front for the people for the liberation of Palestine. And all these little groups, they're all, two people, 5 people, so on and so forth. That's really kind of what it was like in the first century. There were many, many groups, all of which were looking at the impending collapse of institutions, all of which were unhappy with the Romans, one way or another. And the temple was a part of this. Now, when the oh, by the way, you know what one of these groups was sitting in the amphitheater? It was the Christians. It was one of many groups that was interested in the end things that were happening all around. Okay? And although you had those people who were supporters of the temple cult, there were those in the Jewish community, the early Christians being some of them, but there were many others as well, who were not pleased with the temple and were looking for new ways for there to be Jewish expressions. Okay. Some of them became, one of them is a name that you are very well familiar with. They were called Pharisees. Okay. Pharisees, you know that Jesus was a Pharisee, right? Just thought you should know. Okay. Pharisees were just a group of people who were reinterpreting the Torah with the idea that it was going to become relevant in new ways without the temple. Okay, and They wanted to replace sacrifices with prayer and study. That was the general, approach of the Pharisees. They were opposed by a group called the Sadducees, who wanted to maintain the temple cult as it was. Okay, so just as a little excursus, I'll give you an example. How many of you are familiar with the story of Jesus walking across the field on the Sabbath? And he stopped by a Pharisee. And the gospel writers like to use the Pharisees as straw people, because when the gospel accounts are written later on, they're not written sort of in order to distinguish the Christian church from the synagogue. So the Pharisees stopped Jesus and his disciples because they're picking wheat in the field, right? And the Pharisees say to Jesus, "What are you doing? Don't you know that you're desecrating the Sabbath?" Does anybody know what Jesus answers?
Some parable.
Yes, a parable, very good, yes.
The Sabbath was made for man, not the other way.
Right, and did you know he was quoting Rabbi Hillel?
Yeah.
No. See, that's the part that you don't get in the New Testament. Why don't you get that? Because the point is that they're trying to differentiate the church, which is becoming more and more of a non-Jewish or Gentile institution, from the synagogue. They're trying to create their own identity. So, there are a lot of places where Jesus is quoted as saying very wonderful things, and in many of them, not all perhaps, but in many of them, he's quoting another rabbi, which interestingly has the added sidelight of showing that Jesus, whether he was ordained or not, he might have been, was at least familiar with and traveled in the circles of other rabbinic Jewish types. So not that what he said was not valuable, it was, but it was also not unknown or unique in the religious circles in which Jesus was. Okay? So that either upsets you or doesn't upset you. To me, it shows kind of continuity, which is kind of interesting. But it does take away some of the originality that's attributed to Jesus. But on the other hand, these were people who in general were creating innovations within Jewish thought. So the whole movement, the group was innovative. Anyway, so you have among these different groups a whole variety with different agendas, different ideas, different attitudes, different values about what they thought about Rome, and so on and so forth. So I guess you would have to say that there are certain certain dynamics that are involved in any situation like this. It's really kind of like revolutionary times. It's like you think of the Russian Revolution. There weren't just communists. There were Trotskyites. There were, but there were 11 different groups that are involved. In the United States, in our own revolution, there wasn't just a bunch of patriots. There were all sorts of different people with different agendas, different degrees of dissatisfaction with the crown, different methodologies they were willing to employ in opposing the British crown, et cetera, et cetera. All revolutionary periods are like that, and that was true in the first century in Judea. So in this context, I want to put the destruction of the temple in this revolutionary context. So where can you see the revolutionary nature of this time period? Okay, so I'm sure you have read the various accounts in the Gospels of the death of Jesus, the trial, and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and you're familiar with the name Barabbas. Okay, so you have to ask yourself a question to begin with. Since it was a common practice for the Roman procurator to give the crowd a chance to liberate some jailed person for the Passover holidays. How did such people get chosen? I mean, what kind of prisoners were put up there to be chosen?
Political prisoners, why?
Well, yes, they were political prisoners, but what kind of political prisoners? I mean, the gospel accounts refer to Barabbas in a certain way. What do they refer to him as?
A robber.
A robber or a thief, exactly.
Yeah.
That's not a political prisoner, is it?
No.
Well, is he, a common thief? Is that the kind of person that Pilate would put up for the Passover holiday? No. That's ridiculous. Who was he? It turns out actually we have a good idea who he was. So in the first century Judea, among the many groups that were agitating against Rome, was a group called the Sicarii. And they were called Sicarii because that was the name of the dagger that they used to hold and use. You can imagine, in a revolutionary period, you have some who are like, Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King and preach nonviolence and so on and so forth. There's some who are like Che Guevara. And they're, using military means to get rid of the oppressor. So in first century Judea, that was the same thing. There's some, like the early Christians, who were basically nonviolent, but opponents of the regime. Their opposition was basically non-compliance. They were kind of like sort of the hippies of the 1960s. They would go out into the desert and to their little commune and turn on, tune in, and drop out. And the idea was that eventually the Roman Empire was going to be replaced by action of God. It was going to disappear. You just had to wait. And you could even just kind of cooperate with it, as much as you had to. Because any day it's going to just fall apart. And then you had people who thought, that's not the way to do it. You got to get rid of the Romans directly. You got to, kill Roman soldiers, get them to leave. And so there were these bands of people, among them a group called the Sicarii, who would hide out in the Judean desert and in the caves there. And when it's just like the Revolutionary War, when the redcoats would come marching by with their drums and their hats, and the redcoats and the patriots, swamp fox, whatever, come out of the bushes and shoot them. Well, that's exactly what the Sicarii did. They would come out of the hills, out of the Judean caves where they're hiding, and kill as many Roman soldiers in the convoy as they could, then run back into the hills and hide in the caves where the Roman soldiers wouldn't go because they didn't know how to get around there. So the Romans, did I take over time? The Romans used to call, they didn't like these Che Guevara types. They used to refer to them in a derogatory way. You know what they used to call them?
Zealots.
No. First of all, zealots are, all right, no. No, they used to call them common thieves. Common thieves. So when Barabbas is called a thief, what the text is saying is that he was alleged to be a member of the Sicarii. Okay? So he was one of those guys who was trying to get rid of the Romans by going and killing Roman soldiers on the road. Jesus, on the other hand, was among those who were basically saying, time to withdraw from society and let this all get sorted out by God coming in and taking care of the Romans, as God will do. And meanwhile, we just act nonviolently. Okay? Sort of, this is a choice between Martin Luther King and Che Guevara. Okay? I don't know. I mean, if I were in the position of choosing between those two, I'm not sure I know who I would choose, but I certainly would understand the choice either way. Okay? This is the time that we're talking about. All of this ferment leads to yet another unsuccessful revolt by a guy named Bar Kokhba, who briefly was winning the war against Rome. And then they sort of Romans sent their first team in. And that was the end of that. And the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Not just the temple. The city of Jerusalem, they laid it waste. The Romans were really good at that. All of the institutions of Jewish life, the scholars, the rabbis, the priests, etc., all were destroyed. And the result was chaos. In the context of this, a couple things happened. Jews had to figure out how, now that they were being dispersed, as in diaspora, how are they going to be Jews? Could they be Jews? And basically, they create a kind of Judaism that you can take with you. All you need is a text to be able to read. You don't need sacrifices in the temple. You don't need Levites singing psalms. You don't need any of those kinds of things. You just need to read about them and study them. In other words, Rabbinic Judaism comes into existence. And this is a kind of Judaism that you can take anywhere you go. It is a revolution of the first order that you can imagine. We still live Rabbinic Judaism, even though it's grown and changed and so on and so forth through the years. Basically, Judaism is text-centered. It became text-centered in response to the destruction of the temple. You didn't need to have a temple in Jerusalem. You just needed to have the text. Okay. 5 minutes? Yikes. All right. So, I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions at this point, so I have 2 minutes. And I'll pick it up here next time and try to get through the Middle Ages and the Second World War. Yeah, anybody have any questions?
Well, I guess that sort of clarifies for me your rabbinic structure now as to why there's a Jewish community in Syria. Why they went to the European nations. Everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was, like you said, it was a take it with you kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as your community or some part of a community was there, you had your people.
Right. That's true. And also specifically, this is the beginning of what's called the diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
So Jews were expelled from the land of Israel and went to many different places, to Rome, to Spain, to what becomes France, North Africa, and so on and so forth, because they were not permitted to stay in Judea. Although, having said that, not all of them were forced to leave. So there was a continuous presence even from that period onwards. Yeah.
Do you think that it required this kind of chaos and upheaval, the destruction of the temple, for the revolution to occur in Judaism, but also for the rise of Christianity?
Well, I think they come about out of the same proximate causes. Look at it this way. What did it mean to be occupied by the Romans?
It's a hard life.
Well, it was a hard life in many ways, but there are also benefits, though. I mean, this we're talking about the Pax Romana, Roman peace, and so there was trade and so on and so forth. But see, in the Roman Empire, there was room for lots and lots of different religions, as long as you could believe in many gods. Because, you know, from the Roman point of view, what's another god or two? You know, you got a whole bunch of them, no big deal. You can accommodate lots of different gods, what's the problem? But if you believe in there being only one God, there's a problem. Because what you're asked to do in terms of how to show your loyalty is something you can't do out of conscience. So, for the Jews, unlike everybody else in the Roman Empire, they didn't want to be ruled by the Romans. So they were, you know, this obstreperous, ornery little people, you know, kept on rebelling all the time. And, you know, Romans had better things to do. You know, they had places to go, villages to pillage, you know, and all sorts of things to do. And they had to, you know, keep garrisons in this little backwater town called Jerusalem, which wasn't much of anything. Because these people wouldn't just, you know, sit down and cooperate. Well, that's kind of our our position in the world. We don't cooperate. You know, maybe that has caused us trouble over the years, but it's, I think, also partly what's kept us, helped us to survive. You know, so you pay your money, you take your choice. I mean, I think it's fair to say that that although there were those Jews who wanted to come to an accommodation with Rome, they, for a long time, were not the ones in the ascendants. When the revolt against Rome by Bar Kokhba fails, and that's like the third unsuccessful revolution within a century, then a group of rabbis who were not agitators for independence sort of come to head the Jewish institutions. And they do come to an agreement with the Romans to create a rabbinical school in a place called Yavne, which is on the Mediterranean coast. And they preserved Judaism, really, at that point, in the form of this school. What would have happened if they hadn't prevailed, I don't know. But it would have been dicey, for sure. Any other questions? Okay, well, let's stop here for tonight. And we're going to start with the Middle Ages and the Second World War next time, and then I'm going to try to get to life cycle stuff. Yikes. Okay. You're welcome.